This is good B-roll. This is the one they're going to kind of turn their head like this, and kind of do like the bird move. Ready?
Hi guys, welcome back to the Inbound Reporting Podcast. My name is Nakul Karava of HubSpot Services.
Oh, I'm Jory Monroe, and I'm an Academy professor.
All right, and welcome back guys. Today is episode 4, where we're going to be tying business goals into your process and building internal buy-in with one's metrics. So last time was a really good episode. We talked with Julian from your team about actually structuring goals, what goals are, what makes them great, what are the best vestiges of the SMART goal format, what are the best vestiges of the OKR format, how to combine those into something quantifiable and measurable. But really, we really didn't get a chance to actually talk about how you actually use this to apply to your individual teams and generate buy-in into that actual process.
Right.
Which is why we are here with Mike Redford.
Mike Redford, a true HubSpot superstar.
Yeah, he's another famous guy.
Yeah, we're like
another famous guy.
All of our guests.
All of
are
our
super famous.
all of our guests so far have been pretty famous.
Yeah.
And he's top of the list for me.
There you go.
He used to be VP of Support and Services, if I remember correctly. My boss. And then he hopped
also
over.
Mine.
Yeah. And then hopped over to become general manager of our news product suite, which is Service Hub.
Indeed. Hi, everybody. Thrilled to be here. Hey, guys.
So could you walk us through what that means? Like your new role?
Like, what do I do for work?
Yeah,
sure.
What do you do?
So I guess
Tell us about you, Mike.
I've been at HubSpot for a long time, 9.5 years now, and my trade craft really, the way I grew up in the organization with the company, I started was 100 folks, was really just with customers. I spent a lot of time working with customers. I then ran our support team. And then ran our entire post-sale support and success organization, right? And through that, did we just learn a lot at HubSpot. I hope if there are customers listening, you guys have learned to like parts of that service operation and all that. But we just, we learned what not to do. We learned what to do. We learned what worked. We learned what didn't. We learned how to change our goals over time and how to also just sort of, bend the definition of those goals to the way it worked within the organization. There was just a lot that I think we figured out over the course of those 8 years or so. And so now what I'm trying to do is build this Service Hub product, which takes a lot of those learnings and really imbues them into a software product line and takes those learnings and brings them hopefully in an accessible and sort of easy to implement way to our customers. So that's it's kind of a joy being able to take some of those learnings from that time period and actually build a product that carries those forward. It's a nice thing.
Yeah, I think it really worked out well for you because you also came with that just personal experience of just talking to customers every single day. And then, obviously putting it into a management perspective, it works well for us because we talked about business goals. I'm sure you probably did goal meetings, oriented meetings in your time as Service VP, as well as now GM of Service Hub. And, today we want to kind of pick your brain on what were the differences between those two, right? What were the differences of building internal buy-in cross-departmentally, right? As I'm sure many of our customers face that when they have a business goal. And then talk about what are those reporting implications that you think, right? How would you measure your success towards that business goal again? Maybe on your team at Service Hub versus what you guys see with marketing, maybe what you see with services, sales, et cetera, right? That's pretty much what I had.
That's a good summary. So
that's pretty much what I had. Yeah.
Let's start actually then on your time when you were VP of Services. So when you joined that team, how built out was that team when you kind of took it over?
Yeah, so the state of play, the year at HubSpot was 2014 or so was when I took on that role. And the state of play was we had a relatively small support team compared to where we are now that was basically located primarily just in our headquarters office here in Cambridge. Our customer base was global, but we were really located here. We had, the bits and bobs of an implementation team and a success team, but it was very early and somewhat primitive, especially from a goal orientation perspective. We didn't really have fine-tuned goals for each group. And that made it a little bit tricky to understand how all the groups work together to deliver a seamless, frictionless customer experience. So that was really the state of play. And a lot of the work that we then did is figuring out, all right, how does each group become finely tuned? So each group began to take on goals and then sort of, figure out how to achieve those within their own organization. But then across the different groups that I was looking after, part of the work was also how did those groups feather across each other? How do they share goals? How do I have a goal that I can actually communicate to an entire body of people who have very different jobs, right? We had like everybody from onboarding to customer success managers to support reps to even academy and other folks. And so there was a fair amount of tying together of goals that we needed to do in addition to kind of just taking each function and making it higher performing in its own right.
Yeah, so let's talk about that movement a little bit more. So how did you help support the teams identify the goals that would be the most meaningful for those particular groups versus, say, like academy versus support, for example?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of sort of starting with why, right? Great book by that title, by the way. And, when I looked at each function, and, I really like that first principles approach. So let's take support. Basically, that's a team that is there ready for you as a customer when you contact us. And, they're the folks who say, hi, like, thanks for calling HubSpot, and how can I help you, right? And it kind of makes sense that a company would have that team. But if you really start with the basic primitive philosophy of why we have that, it's because people need help in the moment. And if you begin to then weave that story of, okay, people need help in the moment, what would be a valuable way to measure the quality of that help in the moment? Like, what's the right goal to measure that team by, in other words, of people needing help in the moment? And this is not, I think, a trick question. It's meant to be like deliberately almost overly simplified. And the answer is, you would have a fast answer that was the right one.
Right.
Yep.
Checks out.
And give you a resolution. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you'd kind of stop there. Like, there's a lot more stuff that you could do, and entire white papers or PhD theses have been written on this. But like at the most basic level, the reason that we have that team is because people need help in the moment, and the way that you would deliver that mission well is basically fast and good answers. And so you can begin to see how the thread weaves now. You've got the why. People need help in the moment. You've got kind of the basic guardrails of how you would structure the goals, and then you begin to apply actual metrics to those guardrails. So in terms of somebody needing help fast, you'd probably want to measure how fast do we get back to them. So now you start measuring a time to first response. Or you'd want to measure, well, how well did we actually resolve the ticket? And a good way to do that is to, ask the customer if you actually resolved it.
Have a survey.
And so once again, the thinking.
Did you like us?
Yeah, did it work out?
Did it work out? Yeah.
And so the thinking doesn't need to be complicated. I think if you start with why, you end up with a pretty good set of what I would call primary guardrails in your goals. And for a support team, for instance, that really is speed and quality. There's lots of ways to measure them. There's a lot of debate, in fact, within the support leadership community about what's exactly the right way to measure this thing or that thing.
Right.
I'm quite a proponent of spending more time on the why and trying to understand what is our raison d'etre, what is our purpose, and then coming up with ways to measure that, but really pounding the why into the team's head more than the metric that you end up with at the end of the day.
Yeah, and he's saying primary guardrails, Jory. I think last episode with Julian, we were talking about just saying metrics, but I think they're pretty much the same thing here of NPS, average time to response, right? Of the two examples you gave, for example.
Yeah, so HubSpot also looks a lot different than it did back in 2014. So what were some challenges you found when kind of setting these goals as the company was scaling around you?
For sure. So I think when you want to take the time to first response thing, that I think is a very reasonable and in fact normative way to measure a support team. But I mentioned before, we only had a team in Cambridge, and our customer base was global at that time, and we knew there was a gap there. We were behind where we wanted to be in terms of delivering global support. And so when you look at that metric was really good between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time delivered by our Cambridge team. Well, that's only a small chunk of the globe, right? And so I think you have to start to then understand, okay, we have this overall goal of delivering fast support. What are we actually capable of, and what falls into the realm of the reasonable in terms of a metric for that? So between 9 and 5, we should be really, really good. Maybe our response time should be 2 minutes on the phone and a few hours for an email or something. Okay, that's reasonable. But what about a ticket that comes in at 2 a.m. Eastern Time when we only have one person, working the overnight shift or something? And so you begin to kind of flex the definition of those metrics. You still keep the spirit of them. We want to be fast, but what's a reasonable way to understand in our operation today? What's the best we can possibly achieve? That's the way to measure it, to define a metric that the team feels like they can actually hit. And then meanwhile, on the back end, what you're doing as management or as leadership is trying to improve your operation so that you enable the team to do better over time. So for instance, we opened up support in our Dublin office. We opened up support in Singapore. We made other operational changes to the way that we handled shifts. But meanwhile, we put metrics in front of the team that honored that guardrail of delivering really kind of fast support, and we gave them metrics that we felt were actually attainable. So there's a bit of a psychology of this, and also there's a part where leadership does its part, improving the operation, and individual contributors do their part, which is actually hitting the numbers that hopefully are fair and reasonable, and they can feel a sense of success against.
Right. Did you ever have like problems, at least in your support? And then I want to kind of transition to your current role in GM of Service Hub. Tying that organizational led goal into that team's individual metrics as you were talking about, because I'm sure there's always, in any organization with any of our customers, there's always a friction of, oh, well, I'm being measured on this, but I don't think I should be measured on this.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah, totally. I think that when you end up with I don't think I should be measured on this, that's one type of problem where perhaps as a leader, you haven't started with why and you haven't communicated why that's so important. And sometimes, sometimes the metrics that we as individual employees are judged by can feel unfair. And whenever that happens to me, at least, I say, okay, how do I take off my hat of being me and solving for Mike? And how do I put on my company hat and think, why is it this way?
Yeah.
And starting from that perspective can kind of ease that somewhat.
Yep.
But I think when you have any metric, you do end up with this friction. I like to start with why and kind of work it backwards and really spend the time to help every single member of the team understand why we care about this.
Yep.
And that's that's part of new hire onboarding. That's part of ongoing kind of management and conversations. But there are also times when there's legitimate friction and tension in the business between one goal and another. Just take the two goals that I just mentioned. It's quality and speed.
Yep.
Like I can answer every ticket in 5 minutes, but I probably wouldn't do a pretty good job. I might send you a picture of a cat or something. But I'm not going to give you the answer you want, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, that's a core tension that I think people do feel. And navigating that, I think, is part of coaching, is part of management, and from time to time, editing the way those metrics work as your business changes, either from within or exogenous stuff. That's a pretty important part of staying current with the way that you measure stuff. Because yes, we've totally changed the way that we measure response time and support, for instance, going from a team that pretty much did only phone support back in 2010, 2011, to a team that nowadays primarily works over chat and much more modern channels.
Right. Yeah.
So was there ever a time that, as the head of the team, either in your past role as VP of Services or your current role, that you set a goal and swung and totally missed? And what did that look like?
Yeah, I'll answer that from the perspective of my current job, which is a VP of Product.
Right.
So old job, VP of Services and Support, where you have a lot of people,
Right.
And now VP of Product, where there's fewer people and just a lot of software under your domain. And I just think different kind of leadership styles and ways of thinking work differently, for better or worse, for different types of roles. And now I'm in a pretty different role, so I've been able to see that from both sides. So I just described in the support world kind of how a set of, starting with why and then coming up with kind of a set of guardrails and then wrapping metrics around those guardrails was a really good way to go. That worked well because the tools that are at your disposal in that type of function are really people. You're managing people, and people are amazing because they're actually pretty flexible and they can understand this kind of complicated nuance of okay, I have to do X but not Y, and I can make judgment calls about how to feather all that together and make it work.
Right.
When you work with software and machines are amazing too, but they only know what you tell them, right?
Yep.
And so there's a benefit in my current role as a VP of Product, who works with engineers and the software that we produce, to be exceptionally clear and almost more single-minded, almost to the point that my old job function, I'd find it almost silly. There's some comedy in saying this is the only thing that we must do, everything else second. But that type of leadership style and goal setting, it turns out, is much, much more powerful and effective in a world where you're working more with software than with people, because the software is less flexible. And if you just give it the one thing to do, it actually will do that exceptionally well, perhaps even better than people could. But giving it three things to do, it can't make the judgment calls about where to balance priorities and what to do first, second, third. It just sort of can stumble over itself. People are they have a lot more subtlety and sophistication to them than machines do. So nowadays, I really try to, as a VP of Product, be exceptionally clear, say this is the hill that we must take. This is the only thing that we must do. And then you get a lot of oh, what about this? What about that? It's sure, that's not bad. I'm not maligning that. But it's not the thing.
This is not the primary thing. I think I've seen that, at least from a services perspective, on a couple of customers that I've worked with, where I say, well, what is your business goal? And they say, well, we only produce a widget, or we have a software, or we have some primary service. And they say, we have to just do this, right? And the metrics may be one or two things. As you, Mike, was saying, it's good, you need it, but it's secondary, right? And as a result, it kind of it kind of sets apart your implications for reporting to say, well, we're really just going to dumb down to this primary business goal. And then the metrics really are just going to add up to say it's just icing on the cake if we nail it.
Yeah, I think sometimes you know that there is, I'll use an analogy here of, taking a hike or something. There's a destination you want to get to, okay? And there's probably a variety of ways to get there. But sometimes on that journey, you encounter like a big hill, right?
Okay.
And you realize that you must climb that hill. There is no other way to get to your destination other than doing that thing. And in that moment, I think it's really important to be clear that, yep, we have to do this thing. So if there's a company that needs to be single-mindedly focused on one metric in order to win it, I think that's worth it. Sometimes it can be like, oh, well, we could kind of like, on that hike analogy, we could kind of go through that forest or maybe over that stream. It doesn't really matter as much, right? Or there's multiple ways to get there. And that's when, a more complicated or sophisticated set of metrics can really benefit you. But there are certain moments where you realize you need to just do that one thing. And it's actually very, very freeing and powerful and effective to drop everything else. Say, this is the hill that we must climb. When we get over that, there will be new horizons. We'll do new stuff. But for now, this is the one thing that we must do. And I find that especially when you're managing product and machines, that clarity has unusually high benefit as opposed to when you're managing people who can kind of understand the subtlety and understand, oh, we got to go, chart this course around that forest through that. Like, they can handle that and process that in a lot better ways than machines.
That makes sense. So when setting that one goal, for example, how are you prioritizing like what that one destination is? Whether that's like in your current role or your past role, like where as a manager does that kind of inspiration for that business goal come in?
My hope is that everybody watching us, and as well as everybody working at HubSpot or any company really, is able to draw an extremely bright line between the work that they're doing and a business outcome that your CEO cares about. If you're working on something that you can't ladder into that, you might not be spending your time too wisely, or you might just not be doing a great job understanding why the work you're doing is valuable, right?
Right.
And so, when I take a look at like the support rep who does a ticket, it can feel like, oh, another question to answer. Like, I know that feeling. I've sat in that seat. I understand it. But at the same time, we believe, our CEO, Brian, our other co-founder, Dharmesh, like they believe that providing like fast, good quality, best-in-class help is really important. And so as you're answering that ticket, you should be able to draw that bright line from that email response that you're sending back to that, right?
Yep.
I think as you kind of, as a leader, and often a kind of mid-level leader who's not a CEO, you end up with a group level goal, right? But you should also be able to ladder that back into some company level goal. So if you are on, the sales team and you're a sales manager and you have a certain quota roll up and your quota rolls up into, a chief revenue officer or an SVP of sales, the math is pretty easy and the line is pretty bright. Sometimes, if you're in a more back office function as an HR professional, or you run payroll or something like that, there's another jog in the line. But I think you need to really think about, how does my CEO view my job? How is that important to the growth of the company? And if you can't answer that quickly and kind of draw that line, you need to be able to do that. I would take that as homework from listening to this conversation and go do that right now, because that's super important.
Yeah, no, I'm glad because the non-marketing sales service employees who come into HubSpot and start using it may be having this problem where they're like, well, I'm in this platform and I'm using it for my business. I don't really know what I'm aiming it towards. So that's a very good example of just saying, maybe step back and just ask yourself why, as you have, coming back to that, we've talked about doing things like different analyses and meeting with team members. Have you gone about any of those things, like analyzing, those strengths and weaknesses? I don't want to necessarily just say a SWOT analysis, but like, it sounds like you've done vestiges of it already in your current role, let's say.
Yeah, I actually want to give you an example from my prior role when I was running support, because I think this was a clear-cut one, and it also happens to be one that worked out well.
Okay,
I think.
sure.
Also good.
Also pretty good. Yeah.
So I think it becomes a good story. So when I took over our support team, I immediately saw that we had like amazing people. I thought the people on the team were exceptional. We'd actually managed to hire really good people. But other parts of our operation that was a real strength. Other parts of our operation were real weakness. Like our systems were like really bad. And our globalization, like I was saying before, was really bad. And those were just things that we were not good at. And so I made a decision early on there that I think It was probably more instinctual than a thought out SWOT analysis, even though in retrospect I can apply that lens, and it was the right one, I think. But the instinctual decision was, okay, we really need to double down on our people. We're really good at this. We're like best in class at this thing. Let's be exceptional. Let's be number one on the planet at the humans that we actually hire into our support team. And we got really, really sophisticated, and I think really best in class at that part of our operation. Meanwhile, the weaknesses that we had improved. We turned a couple of them into strengths, but I think our strength, our exceptional strength, and that one thing is a lot of what carried us forward. And I think it turned out pretty well because we continued to have amazing human beings that actually deliver really good human style support. And like if you call into HubSpot, and you still have to actually push a button. You can't say I want to talk to support. Yeah. But to me, I think that I would rather have, starting with why, I would rather have as a customer a great human being that I actually work with as opposed to the ability to talk to an IVR as opposed to push a button. And so we made some of those trade-offs where we really wanted to lead into our strengths, we wanted to get our weaknesses to a point where they weren't a detriment, but also, not oversolve them because we sort of knew that that was not our core competency. That was not what we were, amazingly good at. That's not where we were going to win, basically.
And how did you, I guess, connect that with other goals that other teams had? You mentioned a good example with sales. Just saying it's pretty easy or linear, right? The math that they can do, a sales manager or an individual contributor all the way up to how they're measured. How did you do that? How did those meetings go about?
So a big part of, I guess, the business problem that we had in the time when I was taking over our support team was that we were trying to spin up a bunch of other customer service style functions. We were trying to spin up like an implementation team that delivered great setup. We were trying to spin up a CSM team that could actually, help customers with long-term business goals and be a real relationship partner. And what we discovered as we built those teams was that they were just getting sucked into the support quagmire, right? Mm-hmm. They were getting pummeled with questions from customers who either weren't getting the right answer from support or weren't getting it in a timely enough fashion. Yep. So it wasn't fast and it wasn't good. Yep. So we said, okay, we started with why for the team itself. We said, what would this team need to deliver to be good at what they do, just in a very simple way? And then what is the benefit that if we achieve that would bring to these other teams? And a lot of that benefit was in moving work off of their plate so they could focus on their jobs and not kind of get sucked into this other thing that sort of wasn't their job to a degree. Mm-hmm. And so the way that we laddered it all or kind of pieced it all together is that support was going to be the reactive kind of heartbeat of the organization. And then these other groups, or onboarding teams, or customer success teams, were going to be the more proactive parts of the team. And yes, it would be kind of an 80-20 mix. Sometimes support would do something proactive, and sometimes the success folks would do something reactive. But really, we wanted the bulk of their work to be one place or another. So we tried to fit together those goals, again, through sort of simple start with why style logic, and then we moved to wrap metrics around it. And so, we wanted then our onboarding team to have a certain pace of onboarding and quality and deliver certain, usage numbers. We wanted our success team to deliver certain customer success numbers, right? And then each function had its role. Those roles themselves fit together like good puzzle pieces to deliver everything the business needed, hopefully in a contiguous way for our customers.
Chock full of analogies today. This
Love
is
that.
great.
So,
this is really good.
One thing that we've talked about too is so we're making this transition from a funnel-centric world to a flywheel-centric world. So it's no longer okay to let services and support fall to the wayside. Whereas in the tofu, mofu, bofu, nailed it, model, you could, right? Because it was really marketing and sales centric. So when you took over kind of the services team, how are you setting goals and how are you having those conversations and connecting with marketing and sales to make sure that you are also aligning with the other departments at HubSpot?
Yeah, such a good question. And it's something I actually spend a lot of time on when I coach customer success leaders at smaller companies. Because a lot of their conversations, how do I make a better support team? How do I make a better, implementation team? I say, look, that is actually kind of a solved problem. There is a playbook and you can figure it out. Where you really need to spend your time is on building the bridges to other parts of your organization, because especially with customer experience, when you try to look at the customer's entire journey through marketing, sales, and service, it's the sum of all the parts. It's not just your individual thing. And so if you're a leader in marketing or sales or service, anything that really creates customer experience, you need to build those bridges. I really recommend that, for instance, for service leaders who are working in customer success or account management or project management, service delivery, reach across the aisle, and it can often feel like it's a reach and you're going somewhere you're perhaps uncomfortable, right? Reach across the aisle to your sales leader and figure out how do they sell, what are the expectations they're setting, and start to put together the entire picture of when you get a new customer and things go well, what did the sales team do to precipitate that? When it doesn't go well, what went wrong? And then you can begin to edit together as a partnership with that sales leader, with the services leader, like the compensation plan or the way you do training for reps or the way that your sales collateral works to set the right expectations. I think that when you look at the customer experience in a flywheel world, every single little thing that you do matters, sure, but the things that really matter is kind of the handoffs between those departments and the alignment between them. Because if customers move through marketing and they feel one thing, in sales and they feel another, in service they feel another, you can deliver 3 good atomic things, but that's not a customer experience. That's like 3 chunks of experience.
3 random things.
Yeah, and it's not going to be brilliant, right? And so a big part of making exceptional customer experience in a flywheel world at scale is those leaders having really good relationships with each other and being able to read from a common, kind of crib sheet, right? And if you can't, as a service leader, get up on a whiteboard with your sales leader and draw the same experience and agree on it, if you can't stand up with your marketing leader and your marketing leader and your sales leader can't do the same thing of what you want for your customers, like you are doomed. It is never going to work.
Going
You're just doomed.
You have no chance if if you don't have the knowledge of how each other's teams work, if you don't have the knowledge of what the outcomes you want are, if you don't have the knowledge of the way that the goals work and the why behind them, it's just never going to come together. So I think the time is really well spent in a flywheel world, working with each other cross-functionally, and that time is arguably even better spent than time spent working in your team, kind of getting the last mile of goodness out of them.
Right.
That makes sense.
So we talked a little bit about how, for example, you used, the support, your analysis of your support team way back when to say, well, what's the why behind it? Well, we want to give a good answer and we want to give it quickly. Right. So because this is a reporting podcast, what are the reporting implications of doing that kind of analysis or similar analysis, right, towards achieving that business goal? So from the individual contributor level all the way up, what do you have to think about in terms of collecting data? Is it just beyond those 2 things in that example?
Yeah, I mean, I would start with those. You want to start with the core metrics as you go to set up your measurement rig or however you want to think about it. Start with the core metrics, and you want to get really good at measuring those, I think, because those are what's going to make you successful. Along the way, there's going to be lots of other stuff, lots of like exploratory analysis that you could do, but if you can't measure your core, you're never going to achieve that, and you're going to fail, right? And so I think that if you're in support, say you want to measure fast response, you should have some sense of what that ought to be, and say it's like, oh, we want to get back to all of our tickets within 2 hours or whatever it is, first response out. Then you can begin to look at, all right, how does that roll into my managers? Do different managers, when I cut that data by their teams on a human basis, do they have different, do they have different response times? One manager has a response time of 5 minutes, another one has a response time of 6 hours. We're doing something different, right? Or perhaps their teams are different, or they're located in different places. There's some difference in the way that those teams are operating. So I think cutting it by your organization, if your team is big enough, is really useful. I think also cutting it by the type of customers that you have, and are we serving some type of customers well, or not others not well? If you're in a marketing function, are we serving one persona well and another not well, right? And there's various ways to cut it sort of from an external perspective of whom you're serving, as opposed to an internal perspective of who's doing the work. So I'm a big fan of unpacking that high-level metric like that, understanding where you're doing well, where you're not, and then hopefully that leads to a productive conversation around best practices and what's successful and what's not. And you can use that metric to drive discovery of how to basically better achieve that metric, because there'll be certain people or certain segments where you're winning and certain people or certain segments where you're losing. You want to improve the parts where you're not doing well, of course, but the thing you really want to get out of that as a leader is to understand what works, what's the playbook, and what doesn't, so you can begin to run a more consistent and I think more successful operation at scale.
Right.
That makes sense. So how have you brought some of those learnings from like your time as the VP of services to now transitioning into a VP of product for a new product line, which I believe just hit 1 year, ServiceHub?
It was 1 year.
Congrats. That's
Happy
so
birthday
exciting.
to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're 1 year old. You're 1 year old.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how did that translate with this kind of completely new team and new service line?
Yeah, I think that one of the ways that I really like developing product, and I think we have at HubSpot over the years done a good job at this too, is to have an opinion and reflect that opinion in the product. Don't force people to conform to it, but have like what I call sane defaults, right? That reflect that opinion. So for instance, when you pop open Service Hub and you go to the service dashboard, some of the reports that are in there are going to be things that we discovered were very useful over the course of that journey that I was talking about, probably 20 minutes ago. So we have, for instance, like the number of tickets you've had, by day of week and then last week. We have the response time, first response time in there because we believe that's important. I believe it's cut by who did the ticket, because that's a nice way to start looking at it, especially for small teams. So I'm a fan of taking those learnings, putting them into software, which is good at doing that kind of one thing over and over, like we talked about before, and then having those just be like these subtle suggestions in the form of defaults of the right way to measure your stuff, right? Over time, I think, or I hope that our customers of Service Hub will come up with their own ways to measure and innovate, and like I'm watching them for the smart thing that they figure out next. But for now, I think starting with some same defaults that are based off our own experience is a really nice way to take some of those learnings and subtly suggest them, not force them on folks, but subtly suggest that perhaps this is the right way to get going. We've seen that be a reasonably successful pattern because I think for HubSpot at least, and perhaps other people that sell products, like your customers trust you, right? And they trust that you sort of have a perspective, and the reason that they buy from you is partially because of that perspective. So we've seen this be a pretty good pattern.
That's awesome. So do you find that the way that you're aligning with other teams is very similar now that you've moved to product, or is it completely different, kind of its own rodeo?
It's not completely different because each team still wants to feel the same way. So for instance, when I was running our success organization and I worked with the sales team, a lot of that was about demonstrating to the salespeople, we're on the same side, we both want to make a ton of money and grow the business. Well, salespeople that's still their goal. So now me as a product person, that's the same thing. In fact, this morning, right before talking to you guys, I went and I talked to our sales execs about some of the things that are going to be coming up for our inbound conference and coming out next year. And, I demonstrated how that was tied back to the feedback that the sales team brought us. So I still think that, for instance, when working with sales, it's really important to align and show them that you support them. They're not out there on a ledge by themselves, and the company is behind them in their ability to hit their number. But the tools that you have at your disposal in a different seat, as a service leader or as a product leader, are different, and so you kind of tell the story and you make them feel that thing in a different way. But hopefully, you actually are supporting them, and it's just a matter of kind of telling them about the work that you're doing with their lens on, right? And so I don't think it changes that much, but if I didn't understand their goals, their motivation, and their why, I would have given you a very different answer, right? I would have said, no, it's totally different, but no, I'm talking to them, it's the sales persona, and I'm trying to encourage them to feel supported, accelerated, and like we're gonna win together. And so that, that ends up in a similar kind of presentation and conversation.
Yeah, regardless of whether you're VP of success or a VP of product, in this case, it's just, it's a different angle. Is what I was hearing.
Yeah, it's a different angle on the same problem.
It's just on the same problem.
I'm a fan of kind of thinking about most problems are somewhat complex. You can be reductionist about it, but they're somewhat complex and they're kind of three-dimensional, and like they have some nooks and crannies to them, like a good English muffin, right? And so depending on if you see, you can look at it from one angle or another, but only by viewing the problem from multiple angles do you get a complete sense of the whole. Otherwise, you get this kind of two-dimensional, overly simplified thing. When you understand the problem really, really well, you see all the nooks and crannies, and you really get it, then I think it's useful to kind of do the start with why, kind of reductionist thing again. But when you look at the problem from different angles, you're just seeing a slightly different cut of the same thing. And once you kind of realize, yes, this is all the same thing, and I'm just viewing it from a different angle, that can simplify a lot of your logic. It can simplify a lot of your business thinking, hopefully simplify your metrics and allow you to move more agilely, faster as a whole business unit.
Right.
So when you encounter a roadblock and you need to kind of examine the problem from different angles, how much time are you spending kind of analyzing the problem itself versus seeing if you have to go directly up the hill, for example, or take a different route and see if there are different ways around it?
I'm a really big fan of making sure that you identify the problem before you move to a solution. And I think that a lot of the challenges that we have as business people trying to communicate to each other are often we really want to have the solution. We want to be the person that walks into the boss's office with the answer on the piece of paper. That's a fine motivation, but it often leads to misalignment when, someone says, oh, this is a solution, just do X. And it's like, I don't know, is X really the right thing? Often that discussion, that problem there of disagreement is because you never agreed on the problem. X might be a good solution or not, but if you spend 90% of your time on defining the problem and what you're trying to do and why, and you get super aligned on that, the answer and solution should just sort of be, as I like to say, it's just work, right? And there's not a lot of disagreement. The path might be long, but it's relatively simple. There's not a lot of decision making along there. And I think when you align on the problem and you really understand that deeply, that's when you set yourself up for solutions and changes that are like effective and also reasonably friction free from an implementation and rollout perspective. If you are trying to roll something out and nobody understands why you're doing it, it's going to be impossible. If they only understand half of it, half the people you're talking to do and half don't, it's just not going to work, right?
Yeah.
And so, I like to spend 90% of the time on the problem and 10% of the time on solution. And frankly, I find that, at least for me personally as a leader, the folks that are closer to the problem, once we all get a shared understanding, the folks that are closer to it, not at the VP level, but at the manager level or an individual contributor level, they're actually the ones that are going to come up with the best solution. And once we all understand the problem, it should be easy peasy comparatively to come up with a solution.
And to take away from that answer is what we've heard on episodes 1 and 2, friction-free, right, perspective. To use that friction and force from the flywheel when we had Kyle and Adriti kind of explain it to us is like, that could be something that we report on, for example, if it's providing a friction, or if it's not, I should say, so you can identify it as a problem, right, a part of the problem, that it's friction.
So to kind of bring the flywheel into it, I think what you said earlier was really interesting in terms of like starting with why, because in some ways this could be a way that you translate what the flywheel on an abstract level means to almost like the individual contributor level. They don't need to know the nuances necessarily of the flywheel, but it's important they get the kind of core concepts. So how often are you reaffirming your why with your team? How often are you going over that kind of sense of purpose, this is our direction, versus kind of understanding that they reasonably get it?
Yeah, the glib answer to that question, as like a senior-ish leader, is that's all I do, right? When I have a one-on-one with my team, I know what their metrics are, right? I don't know all the things that we're tracking. I can go look at those on a dashboard, and I do, like on a Monday morning or whatever. But when I actually spend time with people, like I don't really want to talk about a metric, especially provided stuff's basically going well. I want to talk about like our motivation and make sure we're on the same page. I want to spend 90% of the time talking about the problem, not the current solution. I'm not interested in project management. I'm interested in vision management and making sure we're all aligned. Like, I want the people on my team to be able to make decisions that I would be really proud of and that are frankly smarter than what I can come up with. And the way that we do that is by aligning on vision, right? And so that's almost all of the why. And it's part of just the way that I personally like to manage. And I think a lot of us do at HubSpot too, which is like have the why, have the metrics, but really work the metric backwards into the why and talk about the reason that we're here, what we're trying to do from a mission standpoint. And I would encourage all you guys watching too to think about it that way, because it's much more motivating and you'll actually get better metrics-based outcomes when people believe in the thing that they're doing, as opposed to just trying to make the scoreboard go higher and get a better metric. Like that kind of mission-driven belief system is an incredibly powerful motivator. So it's where I spend almost all of my time as a leader.
And also, I'm sure it adds a lot more substance when you do get reports of your team's performance, because then you would have spent so much time doing all these one-on-ones and meetings and whatever other like gatherings that you have with your team and saying, well, I know why that's the way it, or I have a better idea of why that's the way that is. Yeah, it gives some serious context to you to say, well, I know this is part of the problem, or I know this was a good problem that we were able to solve.
Yeah, like when you're a leader and you're presenting, maybe at an annual kickoff or a quarterly review to your team, and you're doing an all hands meeting.
Yep.
There's certain slides that the team is going to love, and there's certain slides that they're not going to like, or certain topics and all that. And when it comes to presenting metrics, you do want to present some numbers to produce accountability and demonstrate that the business is growing or whatnot. But I think as a leader, before you walk into that all hands meeting, all right, this is the slide people are going to clap at. And this is the one they're going to kind of turn their head like this and kind of do like the bird move from that Disney movie and be like, what?
I think they did that at one of your meetings.
And I'm sure, and you kind of know that as a leader. And I think it's very hard to actually cut out the stuff people kind of squint at. But generally speaking, the stuff that people are excited about and where you get that like round of applause you didn't expect on a chart, right? When you present that is when that chart represents more than just the chart. And exactly what we were saying here, where that represents a reason, that represents a human-based outcome, that represents a change that we as a team have endeavored to make and succeeded at. That's a very different thing than one line crossing a goal line on a line chart, right? And I think the more you start with why, the more you get the former, the more you get the excitement, the motivation, the drive, and frankly, the less you get the latter, where people are just like, yeah, we're trying to get that line over that line, which is just that's not a sustainable, successful way to operate. I don't think you can do that sometimes. Sometimes it's necessary. It's a judgment call whether you have time to kind of do all the stuff that we're talking about. But the core things you must, because those are the must wins, and those are the things that you need to get the team really motivated about.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go for it.
I was gonna say.
I feel like I'm like doing all the questions.
Yeah. No worries. I was gonna say we are just about out of time, but there's a lot of takeaways I think from this. Obviously, a couple of resources that in addition to this podcast episode, I think our audience can take into account when thinking about business goals. But more importantly, as what we talked about with Mike here, translating that into action or a process with your team. What are the challenges you got to think of? What's the actual map? Is it going up a straight hill, to use your analogy really poorly, or is there a way to go around it? Is there a cave that you can go under? Can you go about it another way, and why? Right? Getting to that point where you are adding further context to your reports later to show progress against your business goal and your metrics, whether they're individual, team-based, whatever, what have you.
Totally.
So, like I said last episode, we do have a lesson on business goals, or several lessons on business goals that we encourage you to check out. We'll add those to the lesson notes.
Definitely. And I also do want to do a shameless plug because you had an entire lesson on Academy, or multiple, about the inbound service framework.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it was a thrill. I basically took like a lot of the learnings, and as I was moving from working full time, like 24/7 on our service team onto our product team, I kind of took a moment to take all those learnings and put them into an Academy lesson called the Inbound Service Fundamentals. And I think there's a lot of cool stuff in there. Some of it has to do with goal setting as well, and a lot of it has to do with the sort of why of what your customers want. If you want to deliver better service, spin your flywheel faster, all that.
Definitely.
Right.
So if you want to learn more about how Mike here thinks about inbound service and how to excel really well, check that lesson out. And then also, if you're more interested in some Service Hub content, I know Adriti's got a ton of lessons that will walk you through the product line that Mike here is helping create and support.
Yeah.
So I think with that,
the only other thing that I was going to say, so last time, obviously, we went through the inbound goals calculator as an asset for everybody. So this time, we have a SWOT analysis document, similar to the approach that Mike has taken with both of his teams, whether it was services and support or, product, which is what he's doing now, to try and address, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats with regards to achieving a particular business goal or key metric. Right, if you want to put it on a team level, for example.
And as you guys heard, I'm a really big fan of identifying those strengths and really doubling down on the things that make you special. I think it's very easy to get obsessed with like the T part of it. What are the threats? What are the things we need to panic about?
Yeah.
Well, there's going to be stuff, right? But I think the way that you win is often by doubling down on those strengths and making that into something truly special and remarkable about your business.
It's a glass half full.
And
I like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
it's great.
Optimistic.
Yeah.
And if you do want a second set of eyes on the SWOT analysis after you fill out, it's set up like a matrix. Feel free to email it to inboundreporting@hubspot.com.
That's all the time we have today. So Mike, thanks for your time.
Yep.
My
And
pleasure.
thanks for
It was great having you.
Thank you, guys.